Well, this isn't the book that never ends. It just feels that way, okay, that we've been in it so long. Let me get this up on the screen for you here. There we go. All right, we've been talking about in Psalms. In Hebrews 12, we've been talking about, the first part of the chapter talks about discipline, and then it leads into what we call 4 exhortations from discipline. That is the discipline of God that God brings into your life. And He tells us, He gives us actually 3 imperatives. He tells us in verse 12 to strengthen ourselves and stand up, lift up your head and your drooping hands, He says. And so He says, strengthen yourself, and then straighten your path, walk a straight path. He's talking about the path of righteousness. And then He tells us in verse 14, and this is where we left off last week, strive for peace with everyone and for holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. I'm going to talk a little bit, by the way, this coming Sunday, not this coming Sunday, the Sunday when I return from the convention, on this whole matter of holiness, but I won't get into that tonight. But He says, strive for peace with everyone. Look, just a footnote here. You know, the goal is not to be contentious with everyone. That's not the goal. The gospel, Paul said, is an offense. So sometimes living the gospel is going to be offensive, and that's because it brings conviction to those who don't know God, okay? But the goal is Paul said, as much as possible, live at peace with all men. And again, Hebrews reiterates that, strive for peace with everyone. If you can live in peace, but not in compromise. Does that make sense? So not in compromise of the truth, but live in peace. And you just have to understand that you can sometimes you can speak the truth lovingly and still garner the ire of an age that you're living in that does not accept the truth of God. But if it's possible, live at peace. But don't forsake the truth in order to keep everybody happy. Have y'all learned something in life? Have y'all learned yet that there's some people that are never going to be happy with you? Have you ever found that out? There's some people, I'm just talking about in real life. You can't make everybody happy. Have y'all figured that one out yet? And a lot of people waste a lot of emotional energy trying to make everybody like them. And the fact is, there are some people they're just not going to like you. And it's okay. Don't waste a lot of energy trying to get somebody to like you. All right? Just a little footnote there. That's no extra charge tonight. All right, so 4 exhortations or discipline. So we've done the 3 that we talked about. And here is the 4th. And this one's a little bit different. It's in verse 15. He says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. So there's a number of things I want to say to that. So what is the 4th exhortation here? It is this. He says, see to the care of the weak. Now let me explain what I mean by that. See to the care of weak. In other words, there are people that are going to be immature in the faith or weak in the faith, or people that are at the door of the faith and they just don't understand it all. And part of our responsibility is to care for the weak. And by the way, this can also include those who have failed and need the care of the brothers and sisters to help move them into the grace of God. The word, in fact, there in the Greek, what they translate the phrase see to it, is actually the Greek word episkopeo. And we got our English word Episcopalian from that. We also, in the Greek, it means to oversee. Epi means before, and scope in the Greek is, well, I bet you can figure out what English word we get from scope. Scope. You know, the scope, like a telescope or a microscope. Episcope is the root word, and it means to oversee, to look over. All right? And so here's what we're exhorted to do. We're to look over or look after those who maybe have failed, those who don't fully understand the gospel, those who maybe have trusted Christ but are very immature and are not experiencing the grace of God. Because did you notice what he leads into? He says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. Now, okay, so let me show you three things about that. The first is, he speaks of fails to obtain grace. That's disregard. To disregard the grace of God. So what he's saying is a person who is weak in the faith, a person who is not in the faith, a person who is immature or have failed in the faith, one of the things we got to help them understand is the grace of God, so that because by their own doing, and the idea again in the Greek there is that they disregard the grace of God through something of their own doing. Now, the context of these things is still this whole matter of discipline. So think of it like this. I think this is safe given the context. They were disciplined by God. They didn't like it because they didn't get it. They didn't understand it. Remember, we talked about that? And as a result of that, it caused them to say, enough. Or they get angry about it, or as in just a moment I'm going to talk, they get bitter because they underwent discipline. All right, are y'all with me? And so they disregard the grace of God. They miss it. They miss that what God is doing is loving and gracious, and He's doing it. Remember what the writer said a few verses back, that the discipline of God in your life is evidence that you belong to God. So when God has to, just like a father disciplines, no child doesn't like the discipline of their father or their mother. And we can say that sometimes when God has had to discipline us, that we don't like that. But here's what happens in spiritual discipline. You're going to either get better or you're going to get bitter. If the discipline works, you get better and you experience the grace of God, and you realize that this is a loving God. He's not giving me what I deserve. He's giving me what I need so that I can go forward. Am I making sense? And that's an act of His grace. Look, if God wasn't gracious, you know what He'd do? He'd zap you. Bzz. Right? But He's gracious, and so what He loves you. If you belong to Him, if you know Him, you're His child. And so what He wants to do is but if you react or you rebel against His discipline, guess what you do? You disregard His grace. And so He says, those of you who are mature, help them not miss this grace of God by becoming belligerent, angry, or pulling away from the things of God. Have you ever seen somebody who got angry at God? And they just kind of stepped away. They just pulled, I don't want to have anything to do with God. And they do that because they're hurting in most cases, or because God didn't do something they thought God ought to do, which, by the way, is a dangerous thing for you to decide what God ought to do. It's actually the height of arrogance when you say, this is what God should do. Why? Because that's what I think He should do. That's the height of arrogance. God really is gracious, you see, because He doesn't just say, really? You think? Job tried that a little bit. Go read the latter chapters of the book of Job before everything was restored to him. And Job starts questioning God. I don't get why you, I don't get why you, I don't get. And I have to tell you, it took him longer to question than I probably would have. But God answers him, says, okay, touche, you want to know? Where were you when I built the mountains? Where were you when I filled the seas? Where were you? And he starts, and finally Job goes, oh, okay, I get it. So what he's saying is, if you're mature in the faith, we have a responsibility to help those who are weak in the faith so that they don't miss out or disregard the grace of God toward their life. Does that make sense? Okay. The second thing he moves on, okay, so see to it that no one fails or disregards the grace of God, and that and I want to talk about this for a couple, and that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. Here's what he says: when a person disregards the grace of God, guess what happens? Bitterness sits in. Y'all ever met a bitter person? I won't tell you, but I did a funeral. I've done too many funerals lately, but I did a funeral a few weeks ago for a person, and they had no additional family except for one sister. And the sister came up to me, and she said this. Now, I had a wonderful relationship with this person that I did the ceremony for, and she loved me, and by the way, loved our church and our ministries and all that. So her older sister, who was the only one left, said, and she had no children. The older sister came up to me and said, "Pastor, keep it short." She was a bitter old woman. That's how her sister described her. Wow. And said she's been that way for years. That's how her only relative. Now, again, she's a sweet lady. My experience with her were always very good, and but the sister said, and everybody that knows her well knows it. Wow. Bitterness is not something that you can cover very well, is it? And what the writer here is talking about is a kind of bitterness that not only affects the bitter person, but affects other people. Now, bitterness first if you get bitter, it's going to destroy you before it destroys others. In fact, bitterness is kind of like drinking poison. You drinking poison expecting it to kill somebody else, because it'll destroy you first. But it can also cause trouble for others. And in this case, he says, look at this, and by it many become defiled. So write that in, defilement. And so what he's saying is we have this responsibility to see to these weaker brothers and sisters, or to help them not miss out on the graciousness of God, and to also keep them from defiling others. And so I want to ask you this, or I want to show you this, I should say, about bitterness, and then I want to ask you a question about it. So why is the writer saying this? It's because bitterness there are two things about it I want you to get. First of all, bitterness is insidious. And it grows slowly. He compares it, and we don't have time, but if we had time, we'd go over to Deuteronomy 29:18, where Moses warned the people of God about a root that grows up inside of them of bitterness. Bitterness is insidious, and it grows slowly. And that's why you may not see bitterness, even in your own life. It may take a while. My experience has been this, that when we get angry because of some circumstance in life, or we get angry at some person in our life, that if we don't deal properly with the anger will simmer. And anger that simmers becomes bitterness. And bitterness is so dangerous because you can deal with anger, but bitterness is harder. Because by the time a person has become bitter, there's been a lot of seething. Does that make sense? And so but the thing is, it's insidious. So it's like a root underground, and that's what the Bible compares it to. And a root is the first stage of the fruit. It starts there. And so you don't see the root. You don't actually see the fruit for a while, right? If you go plant a seedling or something, you don't see the plant initially unless it's just a sprout or something. But there's something underneath that has to happen before something up top happens. And so bitterness is like that. It starts happening in here. And it grows and it develops and it sees. It may start out as anger. It may start out as a feeling of injustice, all kind of things, but something that happened to you that you don't think was fair, whatever, and it starts growing inside. And again, a lot of times we don't even know it because it's so insidious, and others around us won't necessarily see it at that time. But eventually, by the way, how many of you like to hang out with bitter people? Nobody? Of course. In fact, what do you typically do with bitter people? You avoid them, or at worst, you tolerate them. Right? And by the way, most of their communication will be seasoned in some way with their bitterness. And they'll almost always get back to how unfair life has been to them. So, it's insidious. It starts growing before you see the fruit. All right? And so, the second thing I would say about bitterness is that bitterness is, y'all have any idea? You got it. It's infectious. And that's what he says right here. And by it, many become defiled. Look, there's a simple rule in life. You become who you hang with. Somebody said this, you can't run with the turkeys all day and soar with the eagles at night. And so it is infectious. It causes trouble and it contaminates others. And he's talking especially in relation to the body of Christ, the church, that it can be so destructive. It can create so much trouble. So what he's saying to mature believers is, look, we gotta, when you see the weaker brother, help them or help prevent them from missing out on the grace of God, how God is being gracious. Help them see their situation through the graciousness of God so that they don't become bitter and infect everybody else or poison. If you go back to Deuteronomy, when it talks about this idea of a root of bitterness, it's talking about a poisonous root. A poisonous. So the idea is whatever has created bitterness, that bitterness in you becomes like a poison. And it contaminates everything around it. It contaminates other people. And in particular in the body of Christ. Have you ever seen somebody bitter in the church and at the church? I have a lot over the years. And it's interesting because I asked a man one time, when I was pastoring in Florida. And he was a bitter man. He was a bitter man. And I asked him, I said, I want to ask you a question. Why do you stay here? And he looked at me kind of odd. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you hate the church. You hate the staff, including me. You hate any of the work that we're doing to reach people with the gospel. Why do you stay here? Now, fortunately, he couldn't infect because the church was so much bigger than his ability to infect. But he had a little cadre of folks that he had infected, but they no longer had any power. But you know he couldn't answer that question? In another church, I had a man, and he was bitter. He was bitter. Every pastor can tell you stories about bitter church members. But this man was bitter. And you know why he was bitter? I finally figured it out. He was an engineer, very good engineer, but he was bitter because when he was a younger man, God had called him into the ministry. And he resisted the call of God to the ministry, and he ran from that. He told me this. And he ran from it, and he ran from it. And by the time we're having this conversation, he is a man in his mid-60s. He's approaching his retirement from the big corporation, and he realizes that the clock for ministry, I mean, we can do ministry, but you know, the called ministry, that it was, that clock was pretty much gone. And it had soured him, but he had done it to himself by resisting. That's the insidiousness. See, it grows in there, it grows. And he probably wouldn't have told you in those early days, well, I ran from God and it made me bitter. But it did. And by the way, he too tried to infect other people. He couldn't. But bitterness can be infectious. It can do damage. It can cause trouble, and it can contaminate other people. You've probably seen that. I bet, you don't have to confess or call any names, I bet you got some people in your family. I don't really have a family tree. We had a family bush. But I bet you got somebody in your bush or your tree or multiples that are bitter. And everybody in the family knows it, right? So with that, and here's what I want to wind up with. Causes of it, we could talk about that. What's the cure? Let's focus. Well, let me fill this last blank in for you, and then we're going to wrap up with that other thing. So, all right, he said, verse 16, that no one is sexually immoral probably means unfaithful to God, because he connects that with the unholiness of Esau, and it is often a metaphor of sexual immorality is often a metaphor, in particular in the Old Testament, of idolatry or unholiness. And so it depends on who you want to read scholar-wise. Some say this is a metaphor for unfaithfulness to God. Some say it is what it is, and if you study the life of Esau, most likely he was not only unholy or worldly, is probably as good a translation as we. Not only was he unholy or worldly or influenced by the world, as a result of that, he was probably sexually immoral too. Okay, I don't have time to go in that. So defiant is the word to fill in your blank if you're taking notes. So he was unholy. He was defiant to what? To the things of God. And so that's why, again, the writer says, so watch over those who are weaker, those who have stumbled, those who are immature, those who are near the faith. Watch over them so that they don't disregard the grace of God, that they don't become bitter because of the discipline that they've experienced. In this case, that's the context. So they were disciplined, they became bitter. and they defiled, really not only themselves but others, or tried to, and don't let them become unholy like Esau. So really, I guess if I sum that up, I'd say we have this responsibility to help brothers and sisters, those weaker, those near the faith. We have a responsibility to help keep them from having this experience because they were disciplined by God. Y'all get that? Y'all get that? Okay. All right. So we talked about bitterness, which I think is probably the main theme in those two verses. So let's wrap up tonight by talking about the cure for bitterness. Now, causes, we could say circumstances, circumstances. We could say discipline, because that's what was in view here. And we could say relationships. I mean, there's so many things. Injuries, sicknesses. I mean, that's kind of all circumstantial. But you get the picture, right? Things, all sorts of things, injustice, a lack of fairness kind of thing, all of that can cause bitterness if we don't respond properly. So so somebody knows that they're bitter. And I have had people in counseling sessions tell me, I know I'm bitter. I just don't know what to do about it. So if somebody comes to you and says that they're bitter, they confess to you that they're bitter, which may not be a revelation to you, but they say, what do I do? I don't like this. I've had people say, I don't like this about me. But I battle it now because of whatever the cause may be. So what is the cure for bitterness? What is the cure for bitterness? What are you going to tell them? Somebody tell me something. What would you tell them?
Have a positive attitude.
Get positive. Okay. Get positive. And by the way, we have some models to that. The Apostle Paul, right, who said, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. So maybe you would even say, to get positive, refocus. Get perspective. Focus again on your blessings. What are the good things that God has allowed in my life? And by the way, we have more blessings than we realize. But we're blinded by the problems, aren't we? And the devil loves to do that with us. The God of this world has blinded their eyes, the Scripture says. The God of this world is Satan. And so focus, perspective. What else are you going to tell them? All right, the company that you keep. There's some people I really think could move through bitterness if they get away from some people. And by the way, oftentimes bitter people flock together. And so they reinforce each other's bitterness. I hear you. I know. Let me tell you about my problem. And they reinforce it. Look, get around people, and that's part of this whole narrative right here, is that you people, you help keep them from going down that road. All right? So get around, I would say, the right kind of people. I would say get around holy people. Get around holy people. What else would you tell them? Okay, sometimes you need to express forgiveness. And by the way, that's a lot harder to do, isn't it? I'm going to do a series on total forgiveness. What does that mean? Sometimes, let me just say this. Sometimes forgiveness is a moment. You just, I forgive you. And sometimes forgiveness is a process. That is in the present tense. It goes like this. I forgive you, and I am forgiving you. Because tomorrow I might have to do this again. And the next day I might have to. So it is, in the Greek we would say that's present tense. Present tense. I forgive you and I am forgiving. Sometimes it's easy, isn't it? We just say, oh, I forgive you. And we go on. But this usually represents a deep hurt. Sometimes it's self-forgiveness. Oh, thank you for bringing that. Because you see, bitterness can result from something dumb we do to ourselves, and then we won't let ourselves off the hook. I'm in a counseling case with a guy who won't let himself off the hook for something dumb, and he's willing to take full responsibility for it, but he won't forgive himself. So I'm trying to help him forgive himself because I don't want bitterness to set up in his heart, in his life. All right? Present tense. You got to forgive yourself sometimes. If you don't, sometimes that'll lead to bitterness. By the way, most of us have an easier time forgiving ourselves than we have forgiving anybody else, though. In most cases. It's usually when we've done something really dumb and we're living with consequences from the dumb that we have a hard time forgiving ourselves. All right, somebody else, what would you, just a few more before we're gone. Yeah. Seek God. Look, I want to tell you something. I don't know of anything in your life that can't be improved by seeking God. But this too is a process, isn't it? We want to seek God for 10 minutes and everything be fixed. When I say that, I'm using that kind of tongue-in-cheek. We just want a quick fix for everything, don't we? And by the way, nothing fixes things like seeking God. Have you ever heard somebody use this phrase, it's a God thing? Well, there's a lot of truth to that. That is, you don't want to insult somebody's intelligence, but sometimes the easy answer is just simply to say, more God. More God. How are you seeking God? All right. What else would you say? Seek counsel. The Bible says there is wisdom in a multitude of counselors. Now, you know what is implied in that, don't you? Came out of Scripture. You know what's implied in that statement? The right kind of counsel. Because their counsel is cheap. Right? Counsel, you say, no, not the counselor I've been to, or I know somebody went. That's not what I'm not talking about this. There are plenty of people that will give you counsel. And there are a lot of your friends that will give you counsel, but that doesn't make it the right counsel. So what kind of counsel do you want? You want godly counsel. Right? And implied in that statement is that it will be counsel that is not contrary to the truth of God. So if a Christian gives you counsel that goes against the truth of God, you just throw that out. All right? So get counsel. Yeah. And by the way, a counselor can see things, a godly counselor can see things and have perspective that you don't have about yourself. And that's true of you. You can see things in other people they don't see about themselves. We are gifted at demanding in others what we excuse in ourselves. Just a couple more. It's 7:05, so we'll break here. But just a couple more thoughts here. Yeah, your mindset is a huge thing. By the way, I'm working on a message. I don't know when I'll deliver it on your mind. The Bible is full of stuff about your mind. And your mindset is so important. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We have the mind of Christ. We take every thought obedient to captive to the obedience of Christ and on it. If these things are true, set your mind on things above, Paul says. And by the way, it's positive stuff. When Paul tells you to set your mind, he doesn't say set your mind on the pains. Think about the heartaches. He doesn't deny those things, but he says set your mind on the things that are lovely and pure and honest and holy and righteous. Put your mind on the right. What you put your mind on is going to form you. That's why we are to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, Paul writes in Romans chapter 12. What you set your mind on is going to shape your life. Do you know that's why they tell us that a child now, do you know that by the age of 9, a child's worldview is pretty much set? Now that doesn't mean God can't intervene and rearrange and all, but they say that a child's mindset is, a child's worldview is pretty much set by the age of 9. That worldview is shaped by what's been put in here. So mindset, important. One more. Somebody give me one more and I'll let y'all go.
I think you have to come to a mindset and find out yourself what is causing it, and then ask the Lord to take it from you.
Okay, here's how I'd say, get honest with yourself. Get honest. You can't deal with it until you get honest about it. And if you say, well, I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter. I'm not angry. And remember, anger is bitterness in the infantile state. But anger can be, as Barney Fife says, nipped in the bud. You don't let the sun go down on your anger. You can deal with your anger before it becomes a bitterness. And then the jump. But be honest. You can make more progress with God when you learn to be honest with God. And by the way, can I say this to you? You never shock God when you're honest. If you pour your heart out to Him honestly, you may shock somebody else if you did that. But if you pour your heart out to God honestly, God doesn't go, oh, wow, I didn't see that. I didn't see that come. Whoa. Has it ever occurred to you nothing occurs to God? You don't stun Him. That's why be honest with Him. You can't fool God by cloaking whatever it is that's going on, so maybe I can kind of throw Him off course. Just be honest. And until you get honest, you probably won't be able to deal with some of the bitterness, and you'll continue in a road and a pathway of bitterness. All right? Well, I'm going to stop there because if I don't, y'all are going to get bitter. And I just don't want that.